Thank you everyone for joining. Spencer, thank you so much for joining us for our first fireside chat here. For those listening, quick introduction to Spencer. Um, his name is probably familiar if you've been around real estate or ever bought a house. But Spencer was the co-founder of Zillow, Hotwire.la, Picasso, Recon Food, Q, Path, the Supernova family of SPACs, and 75 and Sunny. A very long list. And Spencer served as the CEO for Zillow for nearly a decade. During that time, Zillow won a ton of Best Places to Work awards, grew to over 4,500 employees, $3 billion in revenue, a $15 billion market cap. And more recently, through his startup studio and venture capital firm, 75 and Sunny, Spencer has been an active angel investor in more than 100 companies and incubating several more. And we had arrived, are very lucky to count Spencer as an investor, as an advisor in the business. Welcome.
Thank you.
Spencer.
It's great to be here. I love Arrived, and I'm super excited to talk with you today. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, excited to jump into a couple of different topics, both in terms of your professional background, the investing that you've done, how you think about real estate. But before we go there, would love to learn just a bit more about what was growing up like for you, and what did things look like before jumping into your
Sure.
career?
Let's see. I grew up. I was born in New York. I lived there till I was 12, and then my parents moved me to LA. And I loved moving to LA. I'm a big fan of Los Angeles. As you know, I spent 15 years in Seattle, but I always considered LA home. So I was excited to just have that experience. I grew up in a pretty entrepreneurial household. So my grandparents were entrepreneurs. My dad was an entrepreneur, and he was the business manager and tour producer for the Rolling Stones, U2, David Bowie, Paul Simon, Pink Floyd, The Police, and lots of other great bands in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and I guess all the way to the 2010s. And I saw him pivot his business and his career many times as the music industry and the entertainment industry shifted. So he was one of the first to help artists monetize their catalog. He issued what was called Bowie bonds by David Bowie back in, I think it was the late 80s, where David was one of the first people to sell the royalty stream of his songwriting catalog. That's something that's very common today. He was one of the first to create 360 tours. That's when my dad would go out and raise a couple $100 million from investors, and then they would buy a tour outright. So they bought the 1989 Rolling Stones tour and then took all the risk and produced that tour the way you would produce a movie, where the producer puts up the risk and then gets most of the upside. And that's the way most tours are done today, with these 360 tours that are bought outright. And he really created that, et cetera. I could go on, 10 other examples. But the point was, I was a student of all that and watched that and loved it and learned from it. And that definitely informed my own career and my own interest in entrepreneurship.
Interesting. I feel like, being around the music industry and I think, there's one way to kind of be inspired from the artistry and the creative process, but then the other kind of the entrepreneurial mindedness of your dad. Did you feel like one side or the other kind of influenced you more?
Yeah. My dad didn't really like music very much. And he was not, he certainly wasn't on the creative side at all. He just viewed it as a product. And he viewed the bands as the creators of the product. And so actually watching concerts with my dad was actually always kind of a bit of a buzzkill, because, be standing next to him on the mixing platform or something. He'd be like, those fireworks, that's $200,000. Like, we didn't need that, but that was, Mick wanted that. And, we didn't need that inflatable thing. That was a waste of money also. So, just like I'm sure the producer of a movie thinks that the director of the movie is extravagant in the different expenses that he's driving, but that's part of producing the art. So, I definitely was, I'm not musically creative, but more interested in the creative side of media and the music industry than I think he was. But, that's what creates good creative businesses, is people that can understand the creative side, but also the business side. I think as it relates to startups, what I learned was every tour is really a startup. I mean, I remember as a kid, my dad would come home from work and be like, okay, U2 is going to tour. They've given us these 2 years. They're willing to start in 9 months, and they'll give us 2 years. So now I got to create this company. And just like you would create a startup or I would create a startup, he would spin up a company. You got to hire the lighting designer and the choreographer and the stage manager and the logistics guy and the trucking contractor. And that's like us going and hiring a director of engineering and a head of test and a head of SEO and a head of email marketing as you're creating a startup. And tours are basically startups that last 2 or 3 years. They require $50 to $250 million of venture capital. They create a couple $100 million of revenue and hopefully profit. And then, unlike most startups, they cease to exist at the end of that of that time. So that's how I always viewed his career, was like creating a series of startups.
Knowing what it takes to create a startup, the thought of each tour being equivalent in terms of level of effort of a startup, it sounds very intense.
For sure. But a lot of fun.
Awesome. Well, so I'm curious, as you've thought about, companies that you've either started or, kind of choices that you've made in your professional career, did you feel like it was kind of a, looking backwards, a line, kind of a trend line from some of those early experiences? Or were you really just kind of playing jazz and deciding, where, based on new information, where you might head next?
That's a good question. I think, the trend line has been me trying to solve problems that I care about. And, just to close out the chapter of my dad, he never let me go into his profession. Like, I always wanted to work for him or join his company. And he was always adamantly opposed to anything that looked like nepotism or was nepotism. He's like, look, we'll pay for your education, like whatever the best schools are that you can get into. If you want to go to graduate school, whatever, we'll pay for it. You'll graduate debt free. That's more than 90% of people can say, and so that's a level of entitlement and good fortune that most people will never have. After that, you're on your own. Like, we're not going to give you any money. We're not going to give you can't join the business. Like, good luck, go figure it out on your own. And so I did, and that, I didn't like it at the time, but it turned out that creates a level of grit and self-reliance, which is really useful and important. What I then did over the next 20 whatever years, Ryan, was just find problems that I was passionate about. In the case of Zillow, it was helping people make decisions about real estate and helping them be informed and level information asymmetry. In the case of Picasso, it's helping them achieve their dreams of second home ownership. And we could go on and on, but like, just problems that I care about. And that there's no such thing as a good founder. There's only a good founder of a startup for a particular idea. And I mean, I know you're super passionate about the problem that you're solving at Arrived. And if I asked you to go start a company in the healthcare space or something, maybe you wouldn't be as passionate about that, and therefore you wouldn't be skilled at doing that. So I think it's really important to feel connected to the problem that you're solving.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because sometimes it can seem like it has to be a problem that you've had, professional experience working on before, but it's more so, how passionate are you about solving that particular problem? And are you gonna, spend the time getting through all of the hurdles along the way and the kind of windy road to having success? Spencer, I'm curious, because when you mentioned Zillow and kind of the problem that you saw there that you wanted to solve, what was it that made you so passionate about that problem? Because you'd already had a successful career and massive exit with Hotwire. What made you decide to go do it again with Zillow, and what really pulled you into that business?
When we started Zillow in 2005, the internet was more than 10 years old, but there really were just still a lack of good tools and software and information for consumers. So the top real estate portals at the time were all industry focused. Realtor.com was controlled by the industry, and it existed to help real estate agents or realtors. Brokerage websites existed to help agents, and there was nothing out there that was empowering the consumer. And just some things that we take for granted today in terms of information transparency were nowhere to be found. For example, you couldn't figure out days on market because the industry didn't want consumers to know how long a home had been sitting there. You couldn't figure out price cuts. So whenever a home dropped its price at the time, real estate portals wouldn't show what the prior price was. You couldn't get reviews of real estate agents. You certainly couldn't figure out what people paid for their home, and you certainly couldn't find automated valuation models or what we created of Zestimates. So those are just a couple examples of consumer-facing features that are obvious in retrospect, which didn't exist, and they didn't exist because the industry didn't want them to exist. So that's what motivated us when we were first starting Zillow, was trying to empower the consumer, put the consumer first, and it's obvious in retrospect, but it didn't exist at the time 15 years ago.
Yeah. And did you think about just how many people you could potentially serve with that solution? I mean, housing touches everyone's lives. Was that a factor at all for you, or was it really just kind of?
I mean, the rule of thumb whenever I think about startup investing is I look for big TAM, low NPS. So what that means is big total addressable market. So there has to be a lot of money sloshing around in the category, and low NPS, meaning a low net promoter score. So what are big categories that people spend a lot of money on, but everyone's pretty unhappy? And real estate is like a perfect example. It's like huge category, 1.4 trillion of residential real estate, 100 billion of real estate commissions, 30 billion of real estate advertising, but everybody's upset about it. Like, consumers don't like their agents, consumers don't like paying the commission, agents don't like how they have to find clients, agents don't like their, the relationship with their brokerage, the brokerages don't like the relationship with the franchisors, like everyone's unhappy. And so, but there's a lot of money in the category. So that's a good recipe for a startup. Big TAM, low NPS.
Love it. And I guess when you think about some of the problems you all were solving early on in Zillow, I mean, a lot of those are still there today. Days on market, the change in the price change history. Did you find that a lot of what Zillow became was based on some of those early ideas and things you wanted to solve, or how much did it change from that early phase?
Well, it hasn't changed that much because the philosophy of Zillow hasn't changed. It was always prioritize the consumer, and it still is that way. That was the mission of the company, and it still is the mission of the company, is to prioritize the consumer. So the features have changed, but the consumer as the North Star has not changed. I don't think it'll ever change, and that's been the key recipe of Zillow's success.
Interesting. And maybe in that case, a lot of the consumer needs within homes and residential real estate have kind of largely stayed the same.
Well,
in many ways.
it's a good question. I mean, when I speak at business schools, I get thrown this gets thrown in my face a lot. They're like, "Oh, Spencer, you were so close to like actually disrupting an industry, but at the end of the day, you kind of copped out, you caved. Like, really, what has Zillow done? Like, okay, great, it has a lot of traffic, but the industry dynamics, the structure of the industry, the fact that there are two agents in each transaction, that consumers pay 5 to 6% commission, like that hasn't really changed. So really, yawn is a pretty typical MBA criticism of Zillow. And it's not entirely unfair. Like I get that. I guess I would say a couple things in its defense. I'd say, first of all, I think the impact on the role of the agent, which is something that people don't really think that much about, has been perhaps as significant as the impact on the role of the consumer. Meaning that what Zillow has done is it has created tens of thousands of super agents that have much more market share than they used to, and they do that by buying leads from Zillow. And then they go and have a lower commission split with their brokerage than they otherwise would have, because they're getting so much from Zillow. They're getting leads, software, branding, sphere of influence, basically a website for themselves on their profile page of Zillow. So the role of the agent has changed a lot, and that sort of gets lost and ignored. And then I think there's a lot to be said for consumer empowerment through information. So yeah, they're still hiring an agent, just like they're still going to the doctor, but they're going to the doctor much more informed because of WebMD and Wikipedia and Dr. Google, and now Dr. ChatGPT. And so those services really do make a difference, even though the industry structure hasn't changed that much.
Yeah. Well, I think the data I've seen is maybe more than 200 million people per month are coming to Zillow for that data. So, massive value and bite-sized chunks to all these individuals that rely on Zillow. Do you feel like, looking back, you kind of created the user experience for browsing real estate or for experiencing real estate online? Because before Zillow, was there an experience for browsing properties?
For sure. So, I mean, Realtor.com had, I don't know, 10 or 20 million monthly visitors when Zillow launched, and they seemed like an impenetrable competitor. And, today Zillow is 2 or 3 times bigger than Realtor.com, but they're still a very big number 2. The reason that Zillow was able to pass Realtor.com was by prioritizing the consumer. And that one simple insight allowed Zillow to beat Realtor.com. It's pretty instructive when you think about other categories that a simple insight can help a disruptor or a new entrant beat an incumbent. So for example, the reason that TikTok has eclipsed Instagram in minutes spent is not because it's like new and shiny and Instagram feels older. It's that they had one simple insight, which is that it's more interesting to see content that the algo thinks that you would want to see than it is to see your own friends' content. Basically, the insight is your friends live kind of boring lives. Is my camera going down? Can you still? Okay, there we go. The insight is your friends live sort of boring lives, and let the algo show you what we think you want to see rather than what what your friends are doing. And so that one little insight is why TikTok is so much bigger than Instagram today, and Instagram has scrambled to catch up by making more of their content be from the For You page. So anyway, so that was the insight that we had at Zillow, which was let's prioritize the consumer, and it's why Zillow passed Realtor.com, even though Realtor.com seemed really impenetrable at the beginning.
How did you create that culture? Because early on, it's you and founders of Zillow, but as you grow the team and you build a business around that, how did you kind of keep that focus number one?
There were a lot of little things around the company that we did, like having consumer personas. So I know there are some former employees or current employees watching this. So, they'll recognize Beth the buyer, Susan the seller, Harriet the homeowner, Rachel the renter. Those are the personas at Zillow that Zillow does product development for. What that means is that every employee at Zillow knows that Beth is the buyer persona that they're building for. Picasso does the same thing. Picasso has Bobby, who's the buyer persona, and Oscar, who's the owner persona. We designed for them. And so that shorthand keeps us oriented towards those consumers. And I think the second thing, just briefly, that we did was we built a good culture that allowed for failure. So, and this is something I know we've talked about at Arrived, is making sure that your employees feel empowered enough to try things and experiment and know that not everything will work and that that's okay. And they need to feel, that they operate in an environment where that's permitted and encouraged.
And yeah, love that. We have one of our values as a company is just bias for action, which is really kind of highlighting the value of moving quickly, learning and iterating, and kind of making that cycle as fast as you can.
Very quick story on this point. I can't remember, is Jeff Wilke an investor in Arrived? I think he's not. Okay, so he should be. So anyway, Jeff Wilke, who was the longtime number 2 at Amazon, basically ran Amazon.com, kind of the e-commerce business forever and ever. He once told me that the Amazon team that built the Fire Phone, which was a huge failure, one of Amazon's biggest failures, they were all promoted within Amazon after Fire Phone failed, and promoted like very publicly. And you can imagine many companies would have fired that team, and instead Amazon promoted them all to different positions around the company. And within Amazon, I guess that promotion has sort of become lore as a way to create a culture of risk taking and encouraging employees to try things that might not always succeed.
Yeah, And I guess thinking about kind of what you said as keeping the consumer, first as one of the initial insights and core insights to Zillow, when you think about the success of Zillow, both the scale, but also, the success of the business, building a $15 billion public company within this space, were there other things along the way that you take as lessons that you think kind of were critical to getting to that size of scale? Or is it really kind of more just keeping the foundational ideas in
No,
place?
there were a lot of lessons along the way. I think the big one that jumps to mind is the exploiting of platform shifts. So when we saw the consumer usage shifting from desktop to mobile, we did a great job of pivoting the company in that direction. I mean, I remember within a couple of days after we saw, actually it was the same day that Steve Jobs demoed at the Worldwide Developer Conference the upcoming App Store on iPhone, that we dropped the name of the company. It went from being called Zillow.com to just being called Zillow. And we pivoted the company entirely to mobile within a week or two. I made it clear that I wouldn't sit in any product meetings where we saw screenshots of desktop first. So I told everyone, hey, if I'm in a meeting and you're showing me screenshots of something and it's the web version before you show the mobile version, I'm walking out of that meeting. And I only had to do it one or two times, and the company got the hint that we were going to be a mobile first company. And then we built out mobile monetization very quickly and very effectively. So you might remember the Facebook IPO that was kind of a debacle. The reason for that was at the time that Facebook went public, half of their users were on mobile, and they had never run an ad on mobile. So they had no idea what should the ad unit be, how will it monetize, what will the retention of advertisers be, what will the impact on the user experience be. Those were all open questions at the time of the Facebook IPO. Whereas Zillow figured out mobile monetization very, very quickly. We built a great click to call ad product. And one of the reasons that Zillow became Zillow was because we exploited that shift to mobile. We're probably in the midst of another platform shift right now from mobile to something AI driven. Nobody really knows what. And Zillow and other real estate companies are scrambling to make sure that they take advantage of that. But it's possible that this opens a window of opportunity for somebody to come along and create a consumer driven real estate search experience through AI that allows for somebody to exploit that platform shift. So that was something that I feel we did well at Zillow.
Awesome. Yeah, it's funny thinking about AI, kind of reflecting on the early web was very much text-based and chat-based Discord, then going to more rich user interfaces, and now going back to chat, but instead of with other humans,
Yep.
with
Yeah,
the repository
I
of the
mean,
internet.
I've seen this meme on the internet, but like the joke is Ask Jeeves had it right all along, right? I mean, many listeners won't know what Ask Jeeves was, but that was one of the early portals, early search portals up there with Yahoo and Alta Vista and Lycos. And it was a chat-based search product, which is kind of, it's been 25 years and we're kind of right back where we started.
Yeah, we're tinkering, as you can imagine, and probably most companies are now, in terms of how can we use or apply AI or some of these new developments in things that we're doing every day, and it's going to be interesting to see how that space evolves.
Totally.
I think sticking on the line of Zillow, but shifting slightly. I think one of the things that stood out to me as powerful was just the kind of best places to work awards that you kind of seem to get year after year. I'm curious what you could share from kind of the work that you did there. What did that mean to you?
Sure.
And yeah, anything on
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
process?
That's probably the thing I'm most proud of the 15 years at Zillow, and I think it was 12 or 13 years I spent as CEO, was the company culture that we created. And we did that in a lot of ways. I've already talked about the importance of prioritizing the consumer, the importance of having a mission orientation, making sure that everyone understood how their work connected to something bigger than them. We also did a very good job of leading the company transparently, so people felt that they understood how their work connected to others, but also they understood how the company was performing overall. Those are sort of obvious things. I feel like we also invested in allowing employees to bring their whole self to work long before it was cool. Like, I mean, diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, which today are pretty standard, Zillow helped pioneer. I mean, we were focused on that again long before it had become standard. So it was a great corporate culture, one that allowed for and encouraged risk taking, and created a great place to work. And I think great people, properly motivated, build great products. Great products attract a large audience that generates a lot of revenue, profit, and then hopefully shareholder value. But it starts with great people. Like, that's the beginning of that chain of events, and that's something that I feel we did a good job of at Zillow.
Not surprised to hear you say that based on the conversations we've had in the past. And yeah, I think inspiring just to see the recognition that you all received, that you were able to live those values, and that the team kind of validated that.
Yeah.
As you think about kind of your career after Zillow, and you've been, and at least from my perspective, it seems like very active as an angel investor, but at what point in your career, because you started out, I think, in investment banking, then went into tech and internet startups, and then now, maybe more investing of your time and capital. Were you investing all along the way through those years, or how have you thought about investing just throughout your career?
I had been a passive angel investor in startups really my whole career for 20 years. I wasn't very good at it. I did it kind of opportunistically, like when a former employee would start a company, I would invest a small amount. When I left Zillow about three and a half years ago, I decided to do it more intentionally. I started 75 and Sunny Ventures, which is my family office. I now have about 100 startups that I'm an investor in, including Arrived. Yours is one of the best performing company across all 100 of my portfolio companies, so that's awesome. Of the 100 or so companies I'm an investor in, about a quarter are in prop tech, about a quarter are in the real estate space, about a quarter are in the future of work, HR tech space. And the reason for that is, as we've already discussed, I was such a believer in the importance of having a motivated workforce that I've been looking for scalable software solutions, startups that try to productize employee engagement. So that's about a quarter of my investments. About a quarter of my investments are in the creator economy, influencer, sort of Hollywood meets Silicon Valley type things. And then another quarter are just other things I find interesting. There's a lot of space and AI and robotics things in that last quarter. I usually invest at the pre-seed, seed, or Series A stage. Sometimes later stage, but usually early stage. And then I also incubate new startups, and including Picasso and a couple of the other ones that we've alluded to.
And have you mostly focused on consumer focused?
It's about 80% consumer, but there's some B2B stuff in there too. I generally find the consumer things more interesting and more exciting and more fun. I love brand building, and you get to do that more on the consumer side, but I do have some enterprise companies too.
Great. And I think, a lot of folks jumping on today probably be interested in the real estate side of your portfolio, both prop tech and how you've thought about real estate investing in the past. What are your thoughts today on kind of the current state of the market and how you're thinking about real estate companies today?
Sure.
Any thoughts there?
Yeah, real estate. I mean, the residential real estate market in the U.S. is in a really strange place right now. It's unlike any real estate market that I had been a part of in the last 15 or so years, or I guess 20 years now. It's basically locked up. Like, everything is sort of gridlocked, and it's locked up because we've had this period of very, very rapid interest rate rise that we've never seen before. I mean, we've never seen rates go up by 400, 500 basis points in 6 months or so. And as a result of that, a lot of homeowners have mortgage rate lock-in, meaning that they can't really sell their house because they have a 2, 3, 4% mortgage. And if they were to sell, they'd have to buy a home at a 5, 6, 7% mortgage. And they can't make that trade, and therefore they're just staying put. And so the market today is characterized by very low inventory levels. So there are very few homes available for sale. what few homes are available for sale are selling relatively quickly at relatively good prices, but it's kind of a crappy market because not a lot of homes are selling. So low volumes, meaning low commissions, low advertising for real estate agents, which is why Zillow is not one of the several reasons Zillow is not doing that great. Um, uh, real estate agents generally aren't doing great because sides are down so much, commission dollars are down so much, but home values are doing pretty okay. And then you layer on top of that this weird COVID thing where we had these boom towns where people moved to Jackson and Vail and Aspen and Tahoe. And then as people are being called back to the office, some of those markets, not all, but some of them are having pretty big declines because people are moving back to where they came from, and some of those boom towns are now declining back to closer to where they were. So that's what's happening in real estate. It's a very strange market.
Yeah, and I think you kind of clue in on, one thing that's kind of always been the case in real estate, which is it's a collection of all of these mini micro markets, but maybe more pronounced now than ever, that different areas of the country are maybe experiencing different things depending on how much supply there might be at any one time, or what did they experience during some of the COVID period in terms of population, either population leaving or population joining the new area. So very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's real estate's always been local. Like I kind of hate the question of like, how's the real estate market? That's like saying, how's the weather? It's like, well, where? Like the weather's different everywhere. Within real estate, it's not even just different by geography. It's also different by price point. There are lots of markets where the high end or the super high end are doing fine, but the mid-level and lower end homes are declining pretty rapidly. And there's some markets where it's the exact opposite. So yeah, it really depends, obviously.
Have you thought about whether there's any kind of characteristics that have pushed some of the kind of fractional or co-investing? I know clearly you've had a lot of success there with Picasso around the second home ownership and kind of fractional shares there, and the kind of consumer demand. We've seen very similar on the kind of fractional ownership of investment properties that arrived. Anything you think has been pushing it that way, or is it just
so this is the big trend. I mean, let me actually take a quick step back to take a step forward. So if you think of like the last 20 years of prop tech, the first phase was, call it 1995 to 2005, and that's where real estate websites put listings online. So they took newspaper listings and they put them on the internet. Realtor.com is the prototypical, HomeGain, and a bunch of others. The way they monetized was typically by charging agents for sort order. So that was that first era. Let's call it 95 to 05. The second era, 05 to 2015, was the turn on the lights era. It's where Zillow and Trulia, Redfin, and others decided to empower consumers by turning on the lights, creating information transparency. And the business model at that point shifted. It was no longer charging agents for sort order, it was charging agents for leads. The next era was kind of 2015 to like 2020 or so, and that was around digitizing aspects of the transaction. So it's not just search and discovery at the top of the funnel, it's helping grease the skids of the transaction at the bottom of the funnel. And so you see companies like Tomo, which is digitizing mortgage, or Aloft, which is a Seattle company, which is digitizing appraisal, or Domo, which is digitizing title, et cetera. So trying to make the transaction be more efficient through digitization. And then now you have this new era that we're in right now, which is, let's call it 2020 to current, which is democratizing access to real estate as an asset class. And you have companies like Realty Mogul and Roofstock and Arrived that are helping people access real estate as an investment through fractionalization. And then you have companies like Picasso that are helping people access second homes through fractionalization. So this is a really exciting trend. I'm investing behind this trend, and I love it for Arrived. I love it for Picasso. It's helping people have access to something they otherwise would not have access to, because the ticket price has been lowered thanks to fractionalization. So that's like 20 years of prop tech in whatever that was, like 3 minutes. And the good news is Arrived is right at the center of this, of where we are today, of this really important trend.
I'm glad you mentioned kind of the waves. I think the third wave and kind of digitizing the transaction, but also just the experience of operating real estate, we've really benefited a lot from. But I think it's oftentimes behind the scenes, if you will. And we saw, I think, similar benefits even on just modernizing payments, so that it's a lot easier for people to create an account, add their payment method, and make a purchase or transaction, which I think kind of we take for granted at this point, but in 2015 was not so easy. And so there's a lot of those things that we've really been able to benefit on to create, kind of going back to what you said on how do you create a great customer experience and a high net promoter score. It's like creating that experience requires a lot of these past developments behind the scenes. Very
Yeah, I
interesting.
mean, each of these eras stands on the shoulders of the giants that came before it, right? I mean, like and that's, I watched a super interesting movie called Valley Uprising, which is a
Mm.
documentary about rock climbing in Yosemite, which you're like, okay, what on earth does that have to do with prop tech? So what's cool about it is it gives like the last 75 years of history of rock climbing, which is not something I'm super passionate about. I don't do it, but the point is it reminds us that the athletic achievements that are happening today were only possible because of what happened 10, 20, 30, 50 years earlier. And along the way, you have technological innovations, but also just kind of like mental, it shows people what's possible. And prior
Mm.
achievements empower people to create today's achievements, and that's definitely the case of in any vertical like prop tech. If you think about startups that are innovating today, they stand on the shoulders of what came before them.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, rock climbing, not that dissimilar from starting a company, I suppose. No. I guess if you think about the investments you've made, oftentimes were in startups and in companies. Have you invested in real estate as well, or in residential, or?
Not for any income. I own I
Mhm.
own a couple homes for my own use, and I own a Picasso. But no, I have not done any proper real estate investing. And the reason for that is what allows Arrive to exist, which is I always found it unapproachable and complex. I didn't know where to start. It seemed really expensive. I didn't really know how to do it. I didn't want to deal with the operational elements of it. So I am an Arrived customer. I have an account. I own shares in a couple different Arrived homes. But other than that, I have never been a real estate investor.
All right. Well, I don't think you're alone in Arrive being some of your first rental home or vacation rental investments for income. So
Yeah.
thanks for thanks for doing that and supporting us along the way on that. Let me look at a couple of the questions here. I think one of the things, just carrying off the kind of trend in real estate in general and in the phases, one of the things that we hear from younger investors on Arrived is, they're thinking about a home to live in or making their first property investment. And, I think that's been taking people kind of longer and longer to kind of get to that point, to save up a down payment, especially if you're in a coastal city, to make an investment. I'm curious if that was something that you all thought about in your prior life at Zillow, in the companies that you've invested in, or what you might think we might be seeing in terms of the future of property ownership.
Um, so, I mean, the future of property ownership is complicated because it's become so expensive, right? Like I'm thinking, there are a bunch of people. In fact, I met one today that live. This person lives in LA and he rents, and it's too expensive for him to own in Los Angeles. But he's 31 and he really wants to own a home. And so the first home that he's going to own is a Picasso. He's going to buy a quarter of a house in, I think, Tahoe, and he rents his primary home. And certainly when we came up with Picasso, that was not a use case that we explored or thought of, but it's, I'm sure you have probably tons of customers that Arrived where the only real estate they own is a fractional through a income producing property through Arrived, but they rent their primary home. It's a strange like upside downing of the American dream in a way, to rent your primary home but still want exposure to the asset, and so you own a fractional either as an investment through Arrived or for your own use through Picasso for a second home. But that's okay. I mean, yeah, it's like, it's these, this is what these innovations allow for, is and that's cool. That's great.
Yeah. I think, have you seen folks on the Picasso side living on Picasso as a primary residence yet as well?
We have a lot of people that own multiples. Many people that own two, some that own three. I think the highest we have is we have one person that owns 5 different Picassos, but nobody that owns 8 eights and spends all year at different Picassos, at least not yet. But a very common use case, we get this all the time, is somebody that's reached a certain point in their life and they decided that a second home would enrich their lives, which it surely does, and they maybe have $500,000 to spend on a second home, and they really want a second home in Aspen or Malibu or Tahoe, and then they go to the research and they find out that $500,000 doesn't get you very much in those markets, and they then realize that their home would sit empty most of the time anyway, and so what they decide to do is they'll buy 2 homes. They'll buy an eighth of a Picasso in Tahoe and an eighth of a Picasso in Malibu, each for $250,000. And so now they own 2 second homes, and they're getting $4 million homes in terms of quality instead of $500,000 homes in terms of quality, because they're only buying a fraction. So it supercharges their buying power, and then they'll buy 2 or 3 different homes and have more variety. So that's a very, very common use case at Picasso.
Yeah. Part of the retirement dream. Spend half the year outside of Seattle, the summer in Seattle, and the other half maybe in somewhere a little sunny.
Yep. And that we get a lot of Picasso buyers in Palm Springs who live in Seattle, where they'll buy a quarter of a Picasso in Palm Springs and use it a quarter of the year.
Awesome. Well, let me look at chat here. We've had a lot of questions coming through. I might pull a few. So we have one from Philip, which is really kind of asking about your thoughts on the concept of, and this is a kind of an investing concept, where people are essentially developing single family rental communities. They're doing that in the Southeast throughout the US. I think we're seeing a lot of those developments. How have you thought about kind of what's going on there in that segment?
I think I mean, as a community, I think it's brilliant. I think it solves so many of the issues of SFRs. Now, to be clear, Picasso is not in the SFR business. These are homes that are owned by 4 or 5 families together. They treat them like homes that they own because they do. We don't have rentals, et cetera. But I think it makes a ton of sense to have communities built out with this type of product. There are plenty of neighborhoods and communities that push back on SFR product, and there are some communities that push back on Picasso product as well. And we've encountered some opposition in certain markets, and a lot of that is due to misunderstanding of what Picassos are and how they operate. But communities custom built for this type of product solve a lot of these issues. So I think it's great.
Yeah, I think, in some ways it's there's some infrastructure both for kind of supporting, making it easier to kind of develop a community like that versus scattered lot. But in general, I think there's just such low supply, both in, homes to buy, but also homes to rent. And with more people working from home, they're looking for larger spaces. And we've certainly seen, the rental demand has been really strong, probably also because of higher interest rates, the cost of buying goes up. But yeah, there's just so much need for more housing too. This is actually a question from someone on our team, Alexa, who she clued in on the fact that you said that Arrive was one of the best performing companies that you had invested in. She said, from your perspective,
Sure.
What makes us one of the best?
Well, when I said that, I meant your financial results. But as I said, great people, properly motivated, build great products, which attract great financial results. So it does start with your team and your people. It also starts with the quality of the idea and the timing of the idea. And as I've already said, I think perfectly timed. And Robinhood opened people's eyes to the when you create liquidity of a product, fractionalization through lowering the cost of entry, making it much simpler to invest. All of a sudden, you attract a lot of retail investors in equities. That's what Robinhood did, and Arrived is clearly doing that in real estate investing as well. So it's quality of the team, quality of the idea, execution of the idea. Those are things that have created great business results, and that's what Arrived is seeing.
Yeah, and Alexa, thanks for the softball question back, and for Arrive team members that are listening, and for investors who have participated. One of the values that we have as a company is always build for clients, and so I'm hoping that the Arrive team was motivated by Spencer's story on how simple of just building for clients, how simple an idea of that could be such a big differentiator. In building a company in these markets. Great. And then, Spencer, we lost you for a second, but see you back. All right, maybe one more question here from Kunjan. Let me know if I'm saying that correctly, but is there a good website you recommend to check out new startup companies to invest in?
That's a good question. I mean, Product Hunt is good for discovery of new services. I mean, I think let's see. Angel List is a good resource for things like that. Following investors on Twitter is a really good way to keep your ear to the ground. If you live in Seattle, you should read GeekWire. If you're interested in the LA tech community, you should read .la. Those are news sites, and I'm the founder and chair of .la, full disclosure. But those are news sites that cover startups in each of those communities. So those are a couple of resources for people.
Awesome. And then I think we've got maybe one more question here, which is, I think about 75 and Sunny, but it's from Jeff asking just to hear more about your incubator and ideas that you're incubating, but just to hear a bit more about that.
Sure. I've started 5 companies in the last 3 years, and then I'm incubating 2 others right now. So it's we're very busy. The companies that we started were .la, Picasso, Recon Food, which is a food social network. It's sort of like Instagram for food. Q, which is QUE, which is a great app. It's a streaming discovery service. So think of it as like a social TV guide. It helps you figure out what to watch based on what your friends are watching. So I'm sure this happens to you all the time, Ryan, where you'll be at a party or dinner or whatever, and someone will say, "Oh, have you seen The Diplomat?" Or "Have you seen, whatever, this show or that show?" And you have nowhere to write it down, and no way to remember what to watch, and no way to discover if it's good content or figure out where to watch it. So Q helps solve that problem, and it's growing really, really quickly. And then I'm working on another 2 startups right now, one in the AI space and one in the health and wellness space. So the way it usually works, they're usually my ideas. Sometimes they're my co-founders' ideas, and I do the pre-seed and incubate it, and then usually we raise venture capital for it. And they're so far so good. I get a lot of positive energy from it. Like, I love that 0 to 1 stage of a startup of finding product market fit. I think it's a really fun thing to be a part of. So I'm glad that I'm able to do it at a little bit broader scale now with other co-founders.
Yeah, get the extra support during that phase and continue to make more of the ideas or problems that you see in the world and kind of bring them to life through that process. Well, Spencer, thank you so much for spending time with us today. I think that might be it for the questions that we had prepared, and just hearing more about your story over the years. I think indefatigable, unable to fatigue comes to mind as a word, just hearing everything that you've done through the years. And yeah, thanks again for spending time with us and for the support at Arrived.
Thank you. I do have a podcast. Someone asked. I have a podcast called Office Hours, which is like this, where I interview founders, and then I have another one called Dad, I Have a Question, where I talk with my son about different topics. But thank you for having me. Anyone who's watching this who's a customer arrived, thank you. And it's been great speaking with you, Ryan. And thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Spencer. And thanks everyone for jumping in for the first Office Hours. Would love to hear any feedback on what you thought, what we might be able to learn for future Office Hours type sessions. And thanks again for investing with us and for joining today. All right, see you everyone.